that in some areas it doesn't cool down at night, and that really is impactful on people's health, particularly sleep. So once we collected all of that data, the Kappa Strategy sent us back the report. There we go. And we have 4 maps here on the screen. The first map on the left there, that's the data that was collected directly along the routes by volunteers. And that's our morning traverse run on the left there. And then these other 3 maps are the area-wide maps, morning, afternoon, and evening. And you can pretty quickly see that some areas are quite significantly hotter than others. Downtown Boulder is certainly one of them. The 29th Street Mall area, that's certainly one of the hottest areas throughout the day. And then in the evening, we really called out North Boulder as an area that didn't cool down throughout the day. Oh, and I forgot to mention, we also had another activity running simultaneously. We wanted to engage a lot more community members, and we only had 42 given the number of routes. So I came up with another activity for people to do on foot or on bicycle. So they had a little Bluetooth temperature reader that connected to their phone, and we had them going around different areas of where we were stationed to collect data. We'll actually be running that activity again next Saturday at the Meadow Music event. And we'll be running it for children, which will be really fun. So yeah, once we got these maps back, we didn't want to just present the maps to the public in this kind of formal scientific report. So what I did with them is to create this story map with ArcGIS Online. So one of the first things I wanted to do is compare that heat data that we got to some other data that we had. So I compared it to tree canopy data, which is the map on the top there. Story Maps has this cool feature where you can swipe maps and kind of compare side by side. It's not a statistical comparison, it's more of just a visual comparison. But looking at tree canopy impervious surface, and I also looked at affordable housing data, where some of those community members are living. And the general visual pattern did show that the hottest areas have lower tree canopy and higher number of impervious surface, or higher percent of area impervious surface. But the other big point of the story map was to kind of share the story of the day of that event. So I interviewed some of the volunteers who did the driving and the walking to capture their experiences as well as their reactions to the data, and really, personalize this issue that people experience. It's not just about this top-down view of the whole city of Boulder. It's about the people who experience that heat and those temperatures. So that was something that I really wanted to capture with this story map, which we should be able to share out. It was published a little less than a year ago. So the next thing that we want to do is, now that we've identified these areas, is implement some cooling solutions, namely being urban forestry. So to do that, we have contracted out with Planet Geo, which is actually a local company based in Arvada, and they produce this really great urban forestry tool that is going to be available to the public. Was that sharing? Great. So there are 3 main sections to this tool. The first one at the top here is the view section. That one just shows basic spatial distribution of the urban forestry, as well as some other land cover types that we have in the tool as well. And it also can show canopy change based on some historic data. The plan section of the tool, that integrates a lot of census data. So it'll show more social demographic data within that we can then compare to the physical built environment data. And that's a really important part of the tool because that spatial distribution of heat often impacts lower income and communities of color more than other communities. And then the last section of the tool, the grow tool there, that's for forecasting future canopy goals. So you can input your canopy goal and it will tell you how many trees to plant in that area and what benefits you'll get from it. So I'm going to launch into the view tool and try and do a really quick demo here. So right now we're looking at a map of Boulder as well as outside the city limits as well, which is something that planners wanted. So right now we can see we're looking at census block groups. So each one of those polygons there is a census block group. And we can click on these and highlight them and get all of this data for us. So we have the tree canopy here at 42%. And we can also visualize those other variables. But we can also visualize this data at other geography levels. And what I mean by that is, so we have census block groups, we have census block, we have hexagons, we have parcels, sub-communities, watersheds, and zip codes. A really interesting one to look at is census blocks. So you can see when I change it to that, it's a lot more detail on the map though. Those blocks get a lot smaller, so we can really zoom in. Oops, sorry.
I was going to make it larger.
Oh, okay.
That did not work, so I'll leave it alone.
All right, so we can really zoom in on areas and see like this whole area that I'm circling here might be a census block group. But when we zoom in, we can see that this little parcel there has 43% canopy, which is pretty high. And this one right here, that's just a 7% canopy. So the data can get really granular, but we can get even more granular than this if we look at parcels, and that's looking at individual properties within those blocks. So you can see just how many features there are in this layer. And it does cause the tool to run a bit more slow, but we can see neighbors and compare canopies. So this one here has 76% and just 2 houses down, 23%. So this is a really useful tool in analyzing canopy throughout the city as well as within neighborhoods. And one thing we're doing is looking at Boulder Housing Partners properties and doing tree canopy analysis for each of those properties as a potential pilot site. So we can easily, using this address search function, type in an address and pull up all this data with it. And we also have possible planting area as a variable. And this shows you the amount of land currently suitable for tree planting. This will require some ground truthing. So we'll have people go out in the field, come up with a methodology to verify the amount of land that's actually plantable, because these are largely just estimations based on aerial imagery. And then I mentioned this other data. We have herbaceous, non-woody plants. But the really interesting one, I think, is impervious surface cover to look at. So all of this data is within the tool, and you can view it at all these different geographies. Last thing I'll show you in this section of the tool is the canopy change. And so we have 2015 data and 2021 data in here. We have a subscription with them, so we'll be getting new data every 2 years. So we'll get a 2023 update sometime next year. So we can really track this canopy change over time. But the brown areas there, those are areas where there's been canopy loss, whereas the green areas have the canopy gain. So it's a really good way. You can use these sliders here to kind of filter out values that you're not interested in. So if we say we only want to look at areas that have experienced loss, we can use that slider and all those green ones will disappear. And we'll have all these areas here highlighted now, showing where canopy has been lost during that 6-year period. But one last thing, we can actually view the aerial imagery itself rather than viewing it in those blocks with percentages. So I'm turning on this satellite imagery view of Boulder, and then I can select the 2021 data, and that's going to pop up in green. So all of that imagery there popping up in green, that was the canopy image from 2021. And you can zoom in real close and actually kind of see individual trees here. And then the really cool thing is then if I then select the 2015 data, that will be placed underneath the 2021 data. So there in red, you're seeing 2015 tree canopy that was there in 2015, but it was no longer there in 2021. So that's a way of getting a really granular view of canopy loss in certain areas. So here we can see a large section of tree canopy was cut down. And then we can also view canopy growth in this way. So if I leave 2015 selected and then select 2021, all the areas of green popping out underneath the red, that's areas where canopy has grown, trees just growing, or new trees have been planted like this one here. So just other ways to view the data and get a more detailed view. So moving on here to the plan section of the tool. And I'll try and do this quickly. So we're looking at census block groups. That's the only geography we have for this section of the tool because it's coming from census data. So we essentially have all these variables here on the left-hand side. We have areas with low tree canopy, possible urban tree canopy, median household income, population below poverty, vulnerable population, which is younger community members and older community members, unemployment rates, and education. So we can weight these variables against one another, and the tool will then rank each census block group according to how well it applies to these variables. So this one I selected in North Boulder, when every variable is applied evenly, is the second highest priority ranking. The colors on the map have to do with its ranking, not necessarily the values. And then we can, decide which variables we want to see. So we could look at one variable at a time. If we're only interested in population below poverty, we can only have that one selected. But if say we want to look at that as well as areas with low tree canopy, we can set that to medium. And the tool will just automatically do statistical analysis and then rank the census block groups according to how well they apply to the variables that you select. And then in the last section of the tool, the growth section, that's for forecasting future. So let's say we want to have a goal of 30% canopy. We consult our arborist and find our average tree crown diameter and our local mortality rate. And we can apply that to the whole map. And then we can click on a cell up here and say, okay, our hypothetical canopy is 30%. to reach that goal, we need to plant almost 9,000 trees. So it can give you a really, really detailed figure for how many trees you need to plant to reach your goal once you set these parameters. It is just a computer tool though, so it will tell you if the certain area has a higher tree canopy than your goal, it'll tell you to get rid of, in this case, almost 1,600 trees. So this is why we still need people to look at these tools. And then it can give you a full out report. It will tell you how many trees for the whole city you need to get to reach that goal, as well as some ecosystem benefits that we're still kind of doing some analysis on, but it'll tell you, how much air quality pollutants you'll absorb, how much carbon you'll absorb, and how much rainwater, stormwater runoff you'll absorb if you reach these canopy goals. So yeah, that's the essence of the tool. Right now, we're really focused on the view section, the plan section, to do site analysis and figure out where we want to prioritize tree planting. How can I use research back? Yeah.
Did you have it in?
It's in his mind.
Oh,
It should be Crow.
That's the
Okay. So one other thing that we're hoping to compare with that urban forestry analysis is heat modeling. So we've contracted out with the Georgia Tech Climate Lab, and what they're doing for us is they're creating a land cover map using really, really high quality data. I believe it's at like 3 feet resolution with different land cover types, and then also using historical temperature data to kind of create a base temperature model for the city. And then once that baseline heat model is set, we can then implement planting scenarios and say, okay, if we change this land cover type from impervious to tree canopy, how much temperature reduction do we get? Or we can say, we want this much temperature reduction, how many trees do we need to plant? So we're hoping to integrate that modeling within the PlanetGeo tool, or it might just be done separately. But these are the main tools that we're using to kind of do our site analysis and demographic analysis to determine where we want to prioritize tree planting projects.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, again, I'm Heather, use she, her pronouns. And I am here to talk a little bit about next steps and also how we deal with community and handle community processes, because that was just a lot of data that Adam rolled through. And it's really important to note that this is really, really complicated. So there's that tool that we just rolled through and a few others that Climate Initiatives is investing in. And on top of that, there is data our forestry team has. There's already equity maps. There are already all of these things out there that the city already has. One reason we are looking across a suite of tools is that, for example, the forestry data we have is LiDAR. It comes in really slowly. And with climate change, we know we need to move faster. That's one reason we're looking at PlanetGeo. They claim that their data is LiDAR quality, which is hyper high quality. So one reason to invest in a tool like that is to compare to what we're already getting and see if we can improve on tools. And it's important to note that we bought that tool in conjunction with forestry and Parks and Rec. We determined most of its parameters across departments with planning and such, so that like we could get boundaries that would also be useful to them. So we're trying to invest in tools in a way that's useful across the city and just good for everybody. And ultimately, the reason like why we have people like Adam on board is that we need a lot of people figuring out the best way to use these tools and at this higher level make prioritization decisions. But you can't just do that at the city level. Heat is this salient thing. It is the thing that kills most people out of all of the environmental issues we're facing. And to do this going forward without the community involved would be a grave error and absolutely the incorrect approach. So the first thing we are starting with is trees. It is a nature-based solution. And so establishing this baseline work of knowing where our trees are, looking up and figuring out where it is possible to plant. All of these things are just a really key baseline starting step to get us to a point where we really can launch off with community work. On the flip side of that, knowing where to plant is just one part of it, because where you plant a tree, the tree also has to be taken care of. And we have a So on the Cool Boulder side, we also have the Tree Trust. The Tree Trust is established in Play Boulder, which is a nonprofit. And the reason it is there is because 80% of our tree canopy is on private land. So there's only so much we can do to cool down on public land. So we know that we need to be working with the public in that way, just so we can get trees on the property. However, the leader of the Tree Trust, Mike, who's running it, the most recent number he's found, I think, from San Francisco, is that the first several years of a tree's life cost $2,000. So a problem we have is that the people who need cooling most and who need trees the most are the ones who are probably least likely to be able to successfully take care of them. So it's not just planting trees. It's also figuring out how you can grow a tree. And one of the taglines we've been working with forestry is not plant a tree, it's grow a tree. So we can't come in as the city and say, we're going to plant trees here and then run off and just expect people to take care of them. There's also the fact that in places that really need cooling, such as manufactured homes communities, wind is a huge risk. And how are you going to mitigate that risk with the cooling? So starting with the baseline data, starting with what we can do to actually plant, and then figuring out how we work together with the community to do successfully. And that might mean watering programs. That might mean if you all know Brett Kincairn, his big idea is like a youth-based program where we use an electric bike to haul water around and water things. Just something creative, but a way to create some economic opportunity, a way to take care of trees for people who are burdened if we want to come in and plant trees. But this is really complicated and we want to do it right. So where we are at is starting with what is even an option to begin with. And with trees, it's a 30-year investment before you even have some canopy you can work with. So shrubs might be an option, or maybe something like trellises with plants growing over them. So you increase biodiversity, but also immediately have a shaded structure. I put up a picture on this slide because I think it's really fun. We had a workshop 2 Saturdays ago, and we were out in a park and it was hot. This is like noon. And so we set up pizza under one tree, we had a tent, and then we had people hanging out under another. And the way people move to shade is so obvious. We all do it. I was walking to work today and there were construction workers napping under trees. We all know that trees are part of how we keep ourselves cool. One reason we're doing activities like the one Adam is doing with the Govee, the Bluetooth sensors, is that we all know this, but we maybe don't know it super cognitively. Like we all move towards shade, but it's not necessarily our like first thought to be like, I am moving to the tree because it is cooler than the parking lot. We just intuitively do this. So starting here with trees, where can we plant them? How can we plant them? And then helping people learn just through experiential learning why we do doing this, even though it is something I think we all innately know. And on top of that, there's this incredible opportunity to increase biodiversity and mental health. Everyone likes to move around green spaces and be where there are trees. So there's added benefits to this thing we are trying to start. So we hired actually one of Adam's peers, same cohort in grad school, Aspen Bias. She spent 3 months doing nothing but interviewing people in different departments in the city, interviewing community members, and just talking about approaches to heat. And one thing she learned is that in talking to municipalities across the Front Range, a lot of us are in the same spot. We all know there's hot places. We all know there's vulnerable people. We all know we need to engage with community and get qualitative data to help us figure out how to cool things down. None of us quite know how to do it. And I thought that was an interesting thing that came out of her work. So we have a bunch of interviews that she did that we're relying on as some of our starting basis for like, how do we even begin to work appropriately with community? And a really key part is that we cannot proceed with anything before we have a plan for follow-up. This is such an important thing to everyone's daily life. It would be a grave error to come in and say, here we are to help you cool down, and then take a survey, for example, because Boulder's really, really good at surveys, and then have no follow-up steps. That is a huge complaint. Everyone in the city, one of the first things you hear when you talk to people is like, don't send out a survey. So there's this process we can do at the higher level of figuring out where we can plant and things like that. But we have to pull this all together with a plan with tangible action, because if there's a possibility that we go out to the community when we're ready and we talk to people and we find out that what people really need right now is just money to run their AC. Because it doesn't matter if you have an AC if you can't turn it on. And that's the kind of information we don't really have. And that means we have to work at the speed of trust. We have to work at a community speed as well. So there's always city objectives, and then there's how you work with the community, and they're different. So how do we marry that, and how do we move forward? Potential processes, and this is something Aspen, in talking to people, came up with. One option might be that we create a task force, and they just exist for a while working on this. And they're a team that is made partially of community members. We have a working group, but it has to include community representatives. And one of the suggestions I would have would be to hire the community. Don't bring in a consultant. Hire community members to help us with this, to figure this out. But it can't be a one-off. It can't be short. And that brings up the question is, are we the right department to host it? I don't know. We've got a lot of conversations to have. I think we might be, but there are conversations to have about how we do that community work and how we make it truly impactful in people's lives, and in the end, ultimately protect human health. And Cool Boulder has potential to be a huge part of this. Cool Boulder is our community arm of our nature-based climate solutions work. And I think we can push that a lot with it. People are already familiar with heat mapping from last year. People were stoked on it. We got tons of media coverage. People love to see those maps. So we already know the community really wants to engage with this. And so there's this potential that we can use Cool Boulder in some way to move forward with this. And I think it will be really useful. The event we're doing on Saturday is with Jeff and Paige in Chautauqua. And it is a Cool Boulder event. And it's 3 stations. We're gonna have one under trees in the shade, one in the sun and the grass, and one in the parking lot in the sun. And the whole goal is just show people the differences. And we'll have a little passport, and if kids take temperatures in all 3 places, they can come give their data to Cool Boulder and get a popsicle. It'll be really fun. I'm really excited about it, but it's a good start. And then ultimately, we'd like to run that activity in neighborhoods. So this is kind of our pilot for, hey, did it work? How did the sensors do? How did people like it? That kind of thing. But we do have some engagement and some recognition now from the community that this is a space where they can start engaging about it. So yeah, lots of unknowns, which is, not always satisfying, but I'm really looking forward to the potential of it. And I think we have a lot of input to get before we can really go forward on it correctly. So yeah, that's us. Thanks for your time. I'm happy to answer questions about Cool Boulder, and we're all happy to answer questions about the topic, whatever people might have.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think now we do, clarifying questions and comments is sort of the order that we usually go in.
I just, if you don't mind, just to add one little piece here that I think would be really interesting to the board. First of all, I hope you appreciate the great expertise that's sitting at the end of these tables over here. There's some important threads that I wanted to connect into this conversation so you understand them. First of all, the city does have an urban forest strategic plan. It was approved in 2018. And that was, if it wasn't explicitly stated, our urban forestry program lives within our Parks and Recreation Department. However, we've been working very hard to align the work both of the Parks and Rec Department and our department as we think about the opportunities that our tree canopy really plays. And if you didn't see it, I don't know if Brett brought this forward, but there was the first State of the Urban Forest report that was published earlier this year. And so now I think we have some really interesting opportunities, not only aligning those departments, but we're now having conversations with utilities, another really important player in this, and then planning. So when we had a discussion last month, one of the recommendations of the board was to look at how landscaping requirements are really starting to fit into our updates around our energy code, our building code, and our zoning code. And so that was something, if you happen to watch the city council meeting where we discussed this, it was a really big topic. And I'm going to get into some of the other things that were shared, but just wanted to stress that we have a really interesting opportunity to create those alignments now and think about not just for the purposes of cooling, but how do we think holistically about what we can control. And I think there's a misconception that somehow that urban forestry plan only relates to public trees. They don't. I mean, it is our urban canopy, so it's both public and private trees. So we have some really unique opportunity to align the departments to really think about what our shared vision and shared goals are. And I just wanted to share that that's something that has really surfaced from a lot of the work that these three have been doing.
I just brought that up. I was thinking about it happened in my neighborhood. I'll talk about it later. Sure, it needs to that.
Great, thank you. I think I'll throw it to Hernan first for clarifying questions.
Okay. Can you guys
You
hear
got
me?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess my first question relates to this article that I just read at the Boulder Reporting Lab it talks about the urban forest strategic plan that you guys just mentioned. And it says that basically the rate at which we lose trees every year is larger than the rate at which we plant trees. And now, because of that bug, our urban canopy is at risk. So you have all these mitigating factors. So how do you guys take into account all those factors when you're developing this initiative?
Can you clarify a little more on the factors?
How we're losing our trees
Yeah.
from EIB.
Are you talking primarily the loss or?
I guess, well, this, I guess let's talk about the emerald ash border. That falls under what department's jurisdiction to treat those trees to make sure we don't lose, a lot of them?
So anything on, and Jonathan might need to correct me, but anything on public land is gonna fall to Parks and Rec and Forestry.
Okay.
And then if on private land, that's not within city jurisdiction exactly, but Jonathan,
There's open
are
spaces.
you maybe able to help me out with the jurisdiction of EAB stuff on private land? Or any?
Only to the extent that the department can make recommendations. Our ordinance related to like tree protection, this is something that we're starting to look forward to say, what should we be thinking about in terms of strengthening our tree protection ordinance? But this came up in a pretty big way in the last couple of years where there were some neighbors that were cutting down big trees. A neighbor was unhappy about that. So they came to the city and said, what can you do about that? And it really starts to tread on private property rights. The question then becomes, this will be a conversation for council at some point, which is how far do we want our authority to go in terms of tree protection? But right now, what the forestry department does is you can actually call our urban forester to come to your property, assess your trees, look to see if it's susceptible or diseased in any way, make recommendations. But in terms of authority, we have very little.
Okay.
It's important to note that, our forestry department probably knows where those ashes are. And one reason we're trying to baseline a lot of data is to know what we've got. So if there is an area, say, for example, a census block that is primarily ash, and we know that's going to be an issue, that might become an area to target for planting. So it's just doing co-plantings. Like if you've got a fairly healthy ash, but eventually it might be a problem. One recommendation is to co-plant a new tree so that can begin to grow and then take down your ash before it's in critical shape. But that co-planting so that you get replacement canopy eventually. But that's one reason why we have a lot of data baselining to do, because there might be a section of town that's like, we really need to focus here because this is all going to be lost. But that's part of like the putting in the inputs into the plan. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. And my second question will be and this isn't a question, it's just something to consider. When we're planning a canopy, I guess we have to account for the loss in solar power. I feel like my house, I was looking at the tree canopy website you guys sent, and it has a nice canopy around it. But for example, I cannot install solar power because I don't really have, it's all covered in trees. So I don't know, that's something to consider. As we plan a canopy for the city, we are going to lose spots where panels can be installed as well, at least in residential areas.
I appreciate that comment. One thing to consider is people might take down trees, for example, west of Broadway, for fire risk. So there will be these places where potential opportunity for solar opens up. whilst we're growing canopy elsewhere. And there may be a balance to strike, but I appreciate that thought quite a lot.
Yeah, just the idea of balance. I mean, that would be something to consider, I think. But yeah, thank you guys.
I've also seen on that topic in neighborhoods around where I live, there's a lot of like covered parking, which is solar panel roofing. And so parking spaces are not going to be as able to be covered in trees. And so if you can set that up for buildings or sort of communities, I think that's a great sort of space that you're mentioning.
The other thing I would just point out is that the city does have a solar access ordinance, and that it's a very old ordinance that tries to address this issue of making sure you have access to solar if you want, but recognizing the conflict of priorities of maintaining tree canopy and accessing solar, which is one of the reasons why we created the solar garden legislation in 2010 to create an alternative. Say, look, if you have architectural shading, you actually have tree canopies, you're a renter, whatever it might be, you can still own solar. This may not be on your roof. It sits in a clustered field, but those credits go right to your bill. So there are all alternatives that we can work with. And so we try to deal with those pinch points, so to speak.
Okay, Hernan, if you have no more questions, I think we'll throw it over to Alex and we'll just go down the line.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm good. Thank you.
So I just want to say thank you. That was a really well presented and really diverse in a lot of perspectives. So I really appreciated that. So I have a few questions. One, when you're talking about planning or new planting and growth, is part of the conversation at all focused on kind of natural trees or shrubbery, things that are more likely to grow and thrive here, outside of obviously wildfires or wind taking things down? Is that part of the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are going to be some trees that aren't native that are essentially still very, very useful for biodiversity, for habitat. There's some species that are known to be the homes of things, even though they're not native. But where we can, putting in native trees that are going to require less water and are adapted to here is a component of it for sure. But there's always that balance of native versus non-native. If you're growing an apple tree, for example, you need more water than a native tree. So some of it's going to depend on what people want to do on their own property, but on a bigger planning level, biodiversity is really key. And then whatever is going to be resilient for the space. So I think there's still a lot to figure out there. And then there's also an issue of supply. To put in this many trees, especially native trees, we're pretty sure there's just not enough being grown in nurseries right now. So having that be an element of, hey, not only do we need to plant trees, we got to figure out what trees we want to plant and also get people growing them. So the whole system all the way through. But yeah, for sure. And one really important thing is mixing your types of trees up. So for example, if and when the next pest comes through, it doesn't wipe out a whole block. Getting that diversity in there is really key.
Question I guess this probably goes to Adam. You were demonstrating in the tool it provides a recommended number of trees that should be planted, ideally satisfying some temperature set point or some target that you want to hit. Do you know if that takes into account, obviously it would be hard to take into account wildfires or wind taking trees down and things like that, but does it take into account kind of projected temperature rise over the next decades, or is it assuming kind of current temperatures where we reside?
Yeah, it does. I don't believe it takes that into account. Temperature currently is not integrated into that tool at all. I have seen it integrated into other cities' tools when we were first considering purchasing this. I was playing around with Eugene and Oregon. They have the same tool, and they had temperature in there, but the data set wasn't super reliable. So it's a question of, can we get a reliable key data set within the tool that can apply to that? But I think maybe more what you're talking about is that mortality rate. And that mortality rate should consider everything from wildfires to EAV and just people cutting down trees. So I can find out more about what's totally encompassed in that, but I don't believe that temperature is right now.
I can jump in. So I mentioned we're investing in a lot of tools at Climate Initiatives, and there's one of them that incorporates climate projections. So we couldn't get everything we wanted in one place, but we've got multiple tools in development, and one of those has different climate scenarios. So the hope is figuring out how do we work with this suite of tools to come up with that answer, even though we have to work kind of like across data sets and across tools. And hopefully, I'm hoping that the climate projection one allows us to bring that in. And that also then factors too into types of trees we might plant, given projected temperatures.
And I have two more questions. One, so I think you said we were among like 15 cities selected for this study. Obviously, Boulder as a community has its own priorities, problems, things to address, but are there things that we can learn from the other communities that participated, ideas that they have that we are trying to kind of not explicitly pair with them, but kind of check in with some ideas that have maybe worked or not worked, or just for brainstorming purposes?
Yeah, totally. NOAA did a really great job in like creating a cohort. So we're kind of like the class of 2022. And so they hosted a call a couple months ago where like all the previous cohorts came together and were sharing ideas and updates. So it's very much a community that is interacting with each other. One thing that Philadelphia did last year in our cohort was to pair that study with an air quality study. And I think that's something that Boulder would be interested in doing. I know Boulder Housing Partners is doing an air quality study kind of independently. But yeah, there's a lot of collaboration and like sharing of ideas and projects. We shared our walking activity with the Bluetooth thing with Omaha last year. So they actually conducted that after we shared it. So yeah, lots of opportunities there to collaborate and learn.
And touching base with similar communities across the Front Range, and for example, Longmont is in this interesting flip of where we're at, where Longmont has done a bunch of equity work in mapping, but hasn't done heat activities. So they're considering doing a heat activity this year, and they've been touching base with us and like, hey, how did you do that? So there's a nice amount of like talking to your neighbors, figuring out how you can do that together. And there might even, in the cool Boulder space, and kind of like, oh, we could do like a Boulder's doing something and Longmont's doing something. You make those connections for people across space, and it's more than just Boulder, it's all of us.
Final question is maybe a very simple one, but maybe folds into what you were talking about of community members not just planting a tree, but growing a tree. Do you, maybe not you, but is it clear to people the best time of year to plant a tree that it has the best chance of survival? And is that, I'm assuming that would be taken into account with all of the kind of planting programs that would happen.
Yeah, it's I think that's a big part of the education. So it's like you can plant in the spring and the fall, and I believe our forestry department only plants in the spring. I think that's correct. So like there's the cooler times of the year, the shoulder seasons when you can do it. And that's one of the places I see Cool Boulder coming in. We've got blog posts on this already, and then the Tree Trust runs tree tender training, which is 26 people did it in the spring. There's going to be 2 cohorts a year. So the second one's coming up in the fall. I'll be taking it. It'll be a ton of fun. Just getting that basic information out to people is happening with, there was a sapling giveaway come to the city and the Tree Trust. There's a tree sale coming up in the city and the Tree Trust. And anytime we're doing this, we're trying to partner those efforts with information that's digestible. And then the tree tenders are starting up a thing where it's like, they've got a thing on their website that says, email a tree tender. I am trying to get people to make those community connections and share knowledge, and moving into things like door hangers, any way we can to get the basic info out there is the goal. But trying to never do anything not paired with empowering people to like take the action themselves.
I will say we did a free city comes and plants a tree.
Oh, cool.
I did pair it with like a PDF information, taking care of your tree. So.
All right. I just had one question, which is that at the end, we showed the parcels and there was a recommendation. I couldn't quite tell if it was based on the suitability or the priority of that parcel for more trees, or it could be both, or was both.
Was that when it tells you how many trees to plant?
Yeah, like you had all the different factors which were set, like
Yeah.
medium, and then there's like bright red. I couldn't quite tell if that was high priority or not, or it's priority and suitability, or just suitability.
So the suitability is how suitable the parcel is according to the variables you set,
Okay.
not necessarily to tree planting.
Okay.
Unless you had one of those variables was the amount of space available for tree planting.
Okay, so really that was like the suitability
Yeah.
kind of, but sort of as a proxy priority too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the other section is full that tells you how many trees to plant. Doesn't really take the previous tool into consideration. It kind of exists on its own within the same link. But the idea with that is that it's just telling you how many trees to plant to reach a certain goal. They're working on doing like report outs, so you can do a report out for certain census block groups. But right now they just have a report out for the whole area for all of Boulder. But I think eventually we'll be able to like say, okay, in this polygon, in this parcel, this is how many trees we need to plant, and it can give you a whole report of all the data from that parcel as well.
That's my only question, and I also want to say thank you. This is amazing. It's awesome to see you come so far.
Well, second or third, the thanks, fourth. It's a great presentation, very informative. Most of my questions have been answered. My only other one, Jonathan talked about the feasibility of integrating, percent coverage on a building within some sort of code when something is getting improved. So other than that, I have a vague curiosity about, so on the different predictions, sort of the morning after, so the afternoon coolest chunk is sort of one of the morning's warmest chunks. And so
Yeah.
out of curiosity, like, do you know what causes that? Is it just that?
Yeah, so that was out of all the cohorts last year, Boulder had the greatest temperature differential within one time period, and that was the morning. And it was because of Boulder's has like a very unique topography compared to other cities. So the flat irons there in the morning facing east are just getting hit with sun all morning long.
I was trying to figure out how the sun from the west side of the city. Okay.
Yeah, and then by the afternoon, that is one of the areas with the highest tree canopy, that western side of Boulder. So it's staying relatively pretty cool compared to other areas that start to heat up as the sun goes overhead.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. So I think with that, we can move on to sort of our comments and such, unless I'm missing something. No? So Hernan, if you'll take that away for us.
One sec. What kind of comments are you guys looking for? Like, just, could you clarify that, please?
I think we're probably looking for just initial thoughts. I think especially as we start to consider community and the question of thoughts about how we approach this. I mean, if you have any initial feelings about like continuing work and a responsible way to go about engaging, that's something I'd be really interested in if anyone has initial thoughts and feelings.
I guess my main thought will be something that resonated with me was that what you said about it's not only about planting the trees, it's about taking care of the trees. And I'm not sure how you go about doing that. Like, I guess, would you guys eventually need your separate funding to like not only plant but also like take care of the trees? Will that fall like will that get integrated under a different department? I think that's something that I would like to see. I would like to, start thinking about now. And what I said earlier about the solar panels, I think it's like, how to reach that balance in terms of the residential. I think those will be my two comments. I mean, I'm really excited about this initiative. I think it's really important. So that's something that I do want to make clear. But yeah, I think those would be my two main concerns right now, based on what you guys presented. I hope that's helpful. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, one thing, I think you already touched on this quite a bit, Heather, the awareness of all the different people to stay in touch with in the community sense and how to involve them. I think one thing, especially under the tree care and 30-year period growth, a lot of the residents won't necessarily be here to see the full life of their tree. So whether that be just transient population, student population, renter population, if there's a way to kind of brainstorm, how do you incentivize those people to care? Not that they don't care, But if there's a way to try to incentivize that population, I think that could be really useful. I don't know that I have suggestions. I'm a renter and we still planted trees, so I might not really fall into that category. But yeah, I think that's just something worth considering.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah, I think I think it's something this 80% private thing is something I was thinking about every year. So first of all, I think everything you're doing is awesome. So I think the community thing is going to be the next step, right? Like you said. And in our neighborhood, this just recently happened. There's one of our neighbors, like a little ways down the street, has a bunch of massive old Siberian elms, like, and they're hanging over the street a little bit, and they're shading his yard. And one of them a limb broke off and smashed one of the neighbor's cars that was parked on the street. And he decided, he was like, I'm just going to cut the tree down because it's cheaper than having someone prune these massive trees. And, this is like a 90-year-old tree, and I'm going to cut them down because it's cheaper than having to maintain and potentially falling on their house. And so how do you incentivize? Maybe not force, because I don't think that's the thing to do, because that really pisses people off. But is there something you can do with someone, to incentivize and help people to do that so they don't cut that tree and make people aware of that program, right? So that tree can still be there. So I think that's anecdotal, but something that just happened recently, so it's been fresh on mind. Oh, and I guess another thing, also anecdotal, but I was just visiting a colleague in Idaho, and he had a big tree die in his yard, and he had planted a bunch of, like 6 years ago, he had just planted a bunch of aspens kind of around their back patio. And in 6 years, they're like, 19 feet tall, and they don't need a lot of water, and it shades the area. So I think there could be like short-term solutions where you're planting closer to things and structuring in, where places are tight and using, like, early successional. Those are my comments, but how you do that, like you said, with the community is going to be a challenge. But I think getting the word out, because I think probably a lot of people just aren't aware of what's out there in the city at this point, what is available and what the plans are. I think this is amazing. This is like really near and dear to my heart. I think this topic's really important because I don't like the sun here. I love trees. So, yes.
I think I'm going to piggyback on your talk about, sort of making it accessible money or whatever. Also, maybe working with sort of, this is more of working with sort of more private groups around making sure that the tools that the city is providing are not like skippable. So that you can't just go, those core decisions, you can't just go straight to a private company, have the trees cut down, and not even be aware of the tools that the city could provide to help maintain or whatever. And so just making sure that there's a relationship between city and private companies that are in the tree cutting business in order to make sure that those steps can't get skipped.
That's really good. So if we call one of them, they might.
So that, yeah.
Oh, they're aware.
So just that they have the resources and can go, hey, cool, yep, we can work on this. But first you need to reach out to sort of the city forester, have him do an evaluation, see what the city can provide, and then you can come back to us. That might be. I think in terms of the Cool Boulder project, yeah, I love it. It's really interesting data, and hopefully we can get a lot more tree coverage in those areas that need it. 29th Street kind of area, and sort of the surrounding more industrial parks. Getting more tree coverage there, and working with those residential areas are a lot more receptive to putting trees on private land than industrial areas and commercial areas. And so finding a way to try and work with those companies as well. I think that will be a bigger sticking point than residential areas, because as you said, people flock to trees, and everyone loves a neighborhood full of trees. You've got shade to play in for kids, and adults and teenagers can hang out outside under trees. And so there's sort of a natural incentive in those kind of spaces. So I would love to see sort of an emphasis as well on commercial and spaces to get more trees. Because why do you need a tree outside of work, right? Like it's a lot less of a sort of pressing and sort of self-incentivizing concern there. I think other than that, only good things. It's a very interesting project.
Yeah, and I think this is such, I mean, it's such, you plant trees, people feel it right away. Like it affects people. It's very real, right? Like if you walk down Pearl Street and suddenly, or downtown, there's no trees. Or you go to the park and cut down all the trees in North Boulder Park around the perimeter, as we call it, Big Sunny Park. In our family. But like, yeah, if you cut all those shade trees where people are out hanging out, like people notice, and people notice with more trees. So it's a very real benefit to the community. So I think to get people aware, it should be easy to get people on board. But
I have maybe one final question. Obviously, a lot of this is surrounding trees, but as you mentioned earlier, shrubbery and other types of things are options. Is that, how strong of a consideration is that for, say, Erdan was talking about earlier, having solar access? Is that a way to fold some of that in? Will that get us a decent step still in the same direction, or is the focus primarily on tree?
I think that the middle ground is really crucial. That's a thing we just haven't figured out, is like, what does that middle ground look like? Because you can use shrubs and you can use all these things to boost biodiversity, grow knowledge, create habitat, do all these things whilst you're growing the long-term investment. But yeah, it could be aspen, it could be shade structures, it could be so many different things, and we just don't quite know yet what that could be. So definitely a huge component of it is the fact that people need cooling now. And if we're trying to create a natural cooling strategy, it can't just be trees. So there does have to be some way to have a middle phase that is multi-beneficial. That answers that.
Because I can't help myself, one last comment, just can't help myself. I just want to make sure you see the direct connection, if it wasn't explicit, to a lot of our climate justice work. So it's a really, really critical piece of what we're doing, where you can start, if when you saw Adam showing those maps, when you can start to overlay, looking at those vulnerable parts of the community to say, okay, let's look to see how many of those renters or homeowners actually have air conditioning. That allows us then to start to target our investments, to start to work more directly in those neighborhoods, to say, well, this is where we need to start. You can start to then think about impacts from air quality or extreme heat or floods and fires. I mean, these are the things that we're starting to map and see spatially too when we look at our multifamily mapping. I just think that's a really critical part for us as a department who wants to really prioritize those investments in those communities. We need this data to help us to do it correctly.
that's a really good. Wait, did you show that the Holiday neighborhood was really hot in the folder? In that region?
It was one of those neighborhoods
Was it
that
really
did cool down in the
northwest?
evening,
Yeah,
and I
like up
plan.
And is that a lack of trees or just because the trees are young and small and aren't grown yet? Like,
Well, that's the hard part with the data. It's a lot of that's aerial imagery.
Well, I can verify, there's not a lot of huge trees up there.
yeah, there's not a lot of big ones.
There's,
Yeah, they're small. So maybe a neighborhood like that would be a good place to start, like shrubbery where there's.
every tree that I know, and there's none above like 15 feet.
Yeah, I don't think there are up there, right?
Well, an important thing to note with just data nuance is that like that tool, they have a cutoff at which they consider it a tree. So that's why ground truthing is really important,
Yeah.
because it might be like, oh, we have all these saplings that are like tall, but
I think
the
that's
tool is not going to fix that.
6 foot trees.
Yeah.
There's around 6 foot trees, there's a lot of 10,
Yeah.
12 foot trees that have pretty sparse coverage, and there's no real like 30, 40 foot
Yeah,
giants.
not for a long time, right? Shrubbery and something, and they come back to be a good place.
We've got middle phase.
Because it's not a very old area of town. When we moved up there, there was nothing. Yeah. Have anything? Thank you so much for an incredible presentation, lots
Fantastic.
of informative answers. And I hope to hear from you guys soon with some great, new information.
Definitely keep this on the path to come back to the board. And so we'll just kind of track when there's a really good time to come back to you, get some additional input as the program matures.
Thank you.
I think we lost
Yeah.
it. We also brought you some cool Boulder swag, so.
Yeah, hang on.
Thank you.
Oh, one more thing before we're moving on, this is just another thing. There's a house on the corner of 21st and Forest,
Okay.
maybe 23rd and Forest, right near Columbine Elementary, but it's right there. And I don't know if it's intentional, but they have the coolest, like, I think the tallest tree is probably 25 feet, like it comes right to the second story level, but they have a mix of like all these natural plants, then layers of shrubs, then trees, and they're all grouped around the house and you can barely see the house. And it's like perfectly shaded and has all these cool looks. We always call it the forest house, like free bike by it, it's really cool. But I don't know if it's purposeful, but it might be interesting to know what they've done as a model. Because it is really cool.
21st and forest.
You have some sweat.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Got a good laptop or water bottle for those stickers. Okay, so next up, we have the council calendar preview. You want
That's
to take
me.
that away?
Yeah, for sure. So I can get through this pretty quickly. It's your last meeting. I believe you went through the council agenda committee list and just flagged a couple of things that you thought might be interesting to talk about. So I wanted to come back to this. The one thing I wanted to mention is I think there are going to be multiple items coming your way this fall from some follow-up items that you've already seen. So let me just kind of hit those really quickly. We're going to be coming back with the results of our gas powered landscape equipment pilot. So that'll come to you later this fall. We're also going to be coming back with a pretty significant update on the conversation we just had with council on updating the energy code. That's going to be important as we go back to them Q4, maybe early Q1, but I think we're going to try to hit Q4 of this year. Depends on some upcoming conversations with council. The reason for that, I want to hover on that for just a minute. If you watched the conversation with council a couple of weeks ago on the energy code, it's one of the big topics that I think was really, really critical. If you watch, is that discussion was really themed as a climate discussion. And part of what came up, and which part of the board's recommendation too, is to look at how landscaping fits into that code update, how embodied carbon fits into that update. And what we were able to work through with council is there are updates that are going to be coming forward. So really prioritizing moving towards an electric only, whether it's removing gas, whether it's electric only, using the code as a vehicle to do that, to really drive towards an electrified future. So that's the first piece. Second was the embodied carbon piece that we had a big conversation about for sure. And it was our recommendation that fits better with the building code than it does the energy code, because the building code is your materials, right? It's how you build your building. So thinking about how embodied carbon fits in to that, we asked if we could let that travel along with the building code update that's scheduled for next year. And then there was a lot of conversation about zoning and whether or not we could utilize our zoning codes to get the desired outcomes that we were seeking, which we thought was an interesting idea. So as an update to the board, we've had some really good conversation with our colleagues in planning and development services about how we might phase this project, move forward with an aggressive energy code, and then try to package some of these other elements and really build that as a joint work plan between our departments in 2024. So we'll be talking with council, but what we come back with is, at least as I'm predicting right now, we'll be really focused on an update on the so we want to bring that back to you. Just wanted to give you that kind of buttoning that piece up. A few of the other things that you mentioned that you might want to talk about this fall. First was the Uni Hill commercialization and the affordable commercial program development updates. And that was August 10th and August 17th. So just so you're aware, I don't necessarily think this is an item that should come to the board. And I don't know that it's right to come to the board. So what this is about, I have to look at some of my notes. So what council will do is they'll actually convene as the board of directors of the Uni Hill General Improvement District, that's PID. And the discussion they're going to have is decide next steps for that owned parcel at 14th and College. So the conversation is really going to help inform the work plan that Community Vitality is moving forward with. So there isn't much to react to or inform just yet. And similarly, I think on the second piece, our Community Vitality Department has been working with the Central Area General Improvement District, which is a pilot funded by CAGID. And what they're doing is looking to design a pilot program to think about this new concept, I guess, in revitalization. And so they just want to check in with council whether or not they agree that a pilot program is a good idea. And then they will start designing what that pilot looks like. And so what I flagged for my colleagues over in Community Vitality is when you start to get into that design phase, it might be nice to touch in with the board at that time. So those are the August pieces. Some of the other things that I just wanted to flag in the list, the study session on the budget. Again, study sessions are not the time necessarily to provide board input. They're just, we're asking questions of council and it's giving feedback. And then when we come back with the ordinance, that's the time to make sure that you're in the queue for any updates in that regard. The East Boulder form-based code update, I do want to flag that one. It's a potential item that I think the board might be interested in. So as the Planning and Development Services Department looks at updating that form-based code in the eastern part of our community, the one area, what they'll be looking at as an update to that code are things like character, context, scale, human building design elements, looking at design quality, aesthetics, housing types, adaptable buildings. But I think more importantly is this idea of support of multimodal modality and mobility options. And some of the conversation we've had tonight around landscaping opportunities and some of the more resilient and climate facing things. And that might be a really interesting opportunity for the board to provide some input as council thinks about that update for this code. So if you agree, then I'll work with our colleagues to get that item brought forward to the board before this.
I would at least like to hear about that. We'd love to hear that.
So that, in addition to the items that are already flagged, specifically that are being driven out of our department, I think you're going to have a fairly full fall agenda schedule. And it's all really good stuff.
Any other updates on that?
Those are the updates I just wanted to cover with you. There are other items. Again, as the CAC agenda continues to evolve, things get put on, and we're just going to keep a close watch on those and make sure that you have an opportunity to look at them and flag things that you can make sure that.
I have a question for you and/or Hernan about the Boulder Junction representatives from each board. Is that underway? If it is, how is it going? Are they still trying to sort that out?
The latter, they are still trying to sort it out. I checked in with Hernan and asked him whether or not they had convened yet. And again, that's being convened out of the city manager's office, so we don't really have visibility into that. But I did check in with the city manager 2 weeks ago and just asked, and it's still being sorted. Not because we are changing course in any way, but really making sure that we have representatives from the boards that need to be represented. And we're finding a little bit of a challenge. PAB was a very easy one. Let's put it that way. So
Challenge in getting volunteers or figuring out
yeah.
who's relevant?
no, the first part. The first part.
That's fine.
Yeah, and Hernan, if you have a better update than that, please jump in.
No, I don't.
Okay.
The last I spoke to them was when I sent the email to Nuria saying that I will be participating, and that's the last I've heard of it. So yeah, I don't have any updates on that.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Hernan, do you have anything else to add to the meeting?
No, I'm good. Take it away.
Great. If not, then I think we've hit the end of our agenda unless you two have anything. No?
Well, we kind of do, but we can do it off the record.
Oh, well, our next meeting time. Or is there something else?
We can adjourn first.
All right,
Announce the next meeting. and-
great. So in that case, I will, motion to adjourn or just adjourn it?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Right. Thank you, everyone.
It's still going because I cannot see else. Where did it go?
I just wanted to take an opportunity. I think this will be perhaps your
Like,